Hello and welcome to this video and the first book review of 2022, although technically is the last book review of 2021, as we will be talking about the books I read in December. Pete, the lovely Pete, got me a new vlogging camera for Christmas which has a screen. It goes like that, so if I occasionally look over here at the screen instead of at you, I apologise, I'm still getting used to it, and this is actually the first video I'm properly filming on it. So still finding it difficult not to look at myself, basically. I thought I'd start the video by sharing my stats for the year, just a quick brief run through. So I actually set myself a goal of 48 books. I thought 4 books a month was very doable, but in the end I consumed 64 stories. Now I say it like that because 2 of them are audiobooks and 3 or 4 were like really short stories, and I don't feel comfortable saying I read 64 books when some of them weren't actually books, if that makes sense. These were a combination of both physical and on my Kindle, as you are well aware if you've been watching these book reviews throughout the year. So that totals, this is a bit of a guesstimation of, gotta look at my phone, sorry, 22,104 pages and predominantly fiction. So all very exciting for me. That's the most stories I've ever consumed in a whole year, I think ever, so pretty chuffed with myself at that one. So now let's get into the books that I've read in December, and the first one, as I mentioned, I wanted to finish off the books in my Box of Stories box, which if you haven't seen that video I often link it in these in case you're interested, and the first one of those was We the Survivors by Tash Aw. Tash Aw. Apologies if I'm saying any of this incorrectly. So this follows our main character Hawk, as he essentially tells about his life and how he came to murder somebody. It's set in Malaysia, which is a culture that I don't think I've ever read about. I have been to Malaysia on holiday, but I was a tourist, it's a bit different. So this very much gives you a side of Malaysia that as a tourist you wouldn't have seen, the sort of poverty in it, etc, etc. If I'm honest, I was really quite daunted by this book, even though the back actually sounds quite interesting. I mean, it's not the chunkiest of things and the text is quite large, but there was something about it that just, I never reached for it, and then when I decided to read this one I still put off reading it. Like, it took me a long time to actually start it, and actually I was quite right to be daunted. The writing style and me didn't get on very well, it has to be said. It's all sort of through, it's prose but it's interviews, if that makes sense. So Hawk is telling a journalist about his life and the events that led up to the murder and past the murder, in fact. There was just something about it that I didn't like very much. It was a bit jarring. I didn't like the timeline because it jumped all over the place. You would get a chapter about him as a 6-year-old followed by one of him as like a 36-year-old followed by like an 18-year-old, and I think I would have preferred it chronological. It would have made a bit more sense to me. But I did enjoy how the relationship between Hawk and the journalist built throughout the story. It does cover a number of issues, so as I mentioned there's a lot about poverty and that kind of lifestyle in Malaysia, as well as things like racism, corruption, etc. But it doesn't actually look at any of these in depth. It's very surface, and if I'm honest, if I wasn't quite so stubborn I probably wouldn't have finished this book. I didn't get on with it, and this is one that will go to a charity shop now. So that was We the Survivors by Tash Aw. Tash Aw. I don't really know how to pronounce it. Probably should have looked that up before I started filming this. So as you know, in 2021 I set myself the challenge to, I mean like partway through, I didn't start the year doing this, maybe I should have done, that I should read a non-fiction book and a classic in the month. Now I kind of cheated with my non-fiction, it has to be said. I read This Book Will Make You Sleep by, I don't know who, Jessamy, Hibberd and Usmar. This is actually a book I bought for Pete because he always complains that he can't sleep, so I thought, here, have a book that tells you how to sleep, which he's never actually read, but I now have. I say I kind of cheated. It's very short, text is huge. I had other things I wanted to read in December, so this was the quickest way to get a non-fiction into my TBR. So as you can imagine, this gives you a lot of information about sleep theory and tips on how to make your environment better and ways to train your body to sleep. It was pretty interesting. When I did psychology at A-level, sleep theory and dream theory was always one of my favourite things, and that is touched upon in this book, and it's the bit I enjoyed most. At the time of reading this, I was finding it slightly difficult to fall asleep, but none of the tips in here were particularly groundbreaking, so it didn't really help there. It was just a matter of getting over the period of time that I was in when I was reading this. Saying that, this book did make me yawn an awful lot, so maybe the title is very apt, and read it before you go to bed and then you will sleep. One of the things I found most interesting is that if you have a late night or an early morning or whatever and you're in a sleep debt, you don't actually have to make up all of those hours to be back on track, so to speak. You only need to do a third of them, and that actually did make me feel much better about things. So as I said, for me, and I don't often have that much problem sleeping, to be fair, I'm quite lucky in that respect, but I think if you're at your complete wit's end, some of the tips and some of the ways that they do it probably would be helpful for you. And that is This Book Will Sleep by Jessamy, oh bloody hell, Jessamy, Hibberd and Joe Usmar. Then I came to the final book from my box of stories, which was The Angels of Lovely Lane by Nadine, Dorries, who is in fact, as I'm recording, the UK's Culture Secretary. And she's not a very good one if you like musical theatre. But that's besides the point. We're going to hear and talk about her book. This is probably one that was the most out of my comfort zone. It looks like a book that someone's granny would read. No offence if you read this kind of thing, but it's the kind of book that I would assume an old lady would be reading. It followed a whole cast of characters who were training to be nurses at the hospital, but you also got points of view from the cleaning staff, the porters, the doctors, just everybody got an input into this book, and that is one of the things that I didn't like about it, was there was just too many opinions in it. I think we should have stuck with maybe like 3 of the trainee nurses, and then the other characters could have been there, but we didn't need their points of view in chapters, because it didn't need to be this long. And because there were so many characters, I think it was supposed to be a character-driven book, character-driven story, but as I said, too many, so it was hard to get any sort of flesh on the bones of the characters. And the blurb talks about a girl being admitted for a botched abortion, but that doesn't come until the last quarter of the book. So for 3/4 of this you're going, well, where's this story about the botched abortion? And the bit about the botched abortion was the best bit. That was when the characters came together, there was more of a focus, and yeah, it just came together a bit more when we actually had a plot point. But that wasn't long enough, if that makes sense. That being said, I did actually quite enjoy Nadine Dorries' writing style. I did find myself quite engaged with the characters, I suppose. Didn't really find it a chore, it was quite an easy book to read. It has now made me think that books with covers like this might not be quite as bad as they appear. And actually it reminded me quite a lot of an episode of Call the Midwife, so if that's your kind of thing you might enjoy it. But for me, too many characters, not enough plot, I guess, is my opinion. But a easy and reasonably enjoyable read nonetheless. So that was The Angels of Lovely Lane by Nadine Dorries. Now it's December, so I thought, why not read a book all about a lone shooter in an abortion clinic? So I read A Spark of Light by Jodi Picoult, or Picoult, or, you know, the woman that nobody ever knows how to pronounce her surname. This is a book I found on the free bookshelf at the tube station, and as I said, it focuses on the Centre for Women's Reproductive Health, but largely abortions. And there's a lone shooter holding people hostages. Now the interesting thing about this book is it's told backwards, so you start at the sort of pinnacle of the hostage situation and you work your way backwards in time to the reasons why people were at the clinic in the first place, etc, etc, etc. I am not entirely sure that that works, that backwards part, because sort of halfway through the book, characters are asking questions that you already know the answer to because you've read it in the previous hours. It's told in like 12 hours, something like that. So you already know the answer as the reader to the question that the person in the book is asking. So it kind of doesn't work in that respect. So, and then in other respects it is quite nice because you then learn why the shooter is there and why the people are there and the stories behind them as you've got to know them a bit more, rather than straight at the beginning and then work your way through the situation. So I'm a bit on the fence of whether I liked how this book was told. It is the first one of Jodi's books that I've ever read. I think I've got a couple on my Kindle, but I've never got there. And I enjoyed the writing style, so I don't know, there was something about her because she's written so many books that I've sort of not wanted to pick one up. Does that make sense? But now that I have, I won't shy away from reading some more of her work. Like The Angels of Lovely Lane, there was probably a few too many points of view, which is weird because I do like a book from multiple perspectives, but I think I like it when there's like 2 or 3 so that you can really get to know those characters but get to know the opinions of the people around them as well, because that helps build that character. But when there's like, I think there's like 6 or 7 in this one, I just think that's a few too many. But it does portray the abortion argument very well. It is quite even in its portrayal of pro-life, pro-choice, and it was quite thought-provoking, just due to the subject matter. It was quite a thought-provoking book. Obviously the subject matter can be quite triggering for some, but if it's not something that affects you, then I would recommend picking up A Spark of Light by Jodi Picoult. Or Picoult, or however the hell we say her name. Someone needs to definitively tell people, because no one on YouTube ever seems to know how to pronounce it. That's besides the point. So as I mentioned, I've been doing a non-fiction and a classic. So this month's classic was Mary Poppins Opens the Door. I have read Mary Poppins and Mary Poppins Comes Back, I think was the second one. If I can find the video where I talk about either of those, I'll link one up here for you if you're interested. And largely I've got the same thing to say that I say about every Mary Poppins book, in that I'm so ingrained into the Disney version of Mary Poppins that I find fiction Mary Poppins a little bit difficult. However, this book was written like 10 years after the other two, and Mary Poppins seems a little bit softer, a little bit more human in this one, and a little bit more like the Disney films, so it was a bit easier to consume, I guess. There are 5 children in the Mary Poppins books, but in this one Jane and Michael were like the only 2 really involved. Again, I wonder if that had any influence on there only being 2 children in the Disney film. But I did find that the stories in this one were not as strong as the other 2 books. If you don't really know the Mary Poppins books, each chapter is like a separate adventure, I guess, for the kids. But yeah, this one didn't seem quite as strong. There wasn't really any sort of big standout story in this one for me personally. That being said though, there was a bit about a fish party, and I want to know who came up with it first. Was it P.L. Travers for Mary Poppins? I don't think I said who wrote it. It's P.L. Travers. Yeah, was it her for this Mary Poppins book, or was it whoever wrote Bedknobs and Broomsticks? Just intrigued. So that was Mary Poppins Opens the Door by P.L. Travers. And then, it being December, it was time to read some festive books. Not that I normally do, because I don't normally have any on my bookshelf to read, but I did this year. So I started off with Let It Snow by John Green, Maureen Johnson and Lauren Myracle. This is the only John Green book I haven't read other than his new non-fiction. So when I saw it in a charity shop, I think in Blackpool, I grabbed it quickly because it's one I've wanted to read for a little while. So this is obviously by the 3 authors. Each author has their own short story to write, and it's all based around the worst blizzard in 50 years that happens on Christmas Eve. I very much like the fact that they were on a theme and that characters from the other stories appeared in. I very much enjoy it when books take a character or a plot point or a theme and then intertwine it into other parts of their work. Millie Johnson does that a lot. We'll come to her in a minute. So that I liked very much. The 3 stories were all very sweet. They were very nice Christmas reads, snowy reads, but they were kind of implausible. I'm sorry, but I like it when something feels a bit more real, and someone rushing around trying to find a micro pig, or teenage kids in the middle of a storm trying to battle their way to a Waffle House to meet some cheerleaders. I just don't see it happening, but maybe that's because I'm in the UK and I actually don't really understand the whole thing about cheerleaders anyway. That was one of my points about this book. There's a hell of a lot about cheerleaders and I don't really understand it. We don't have them in the UK, so my only knowledge of cheerleaders is from American teenage films where they're like seen as gods, but I don't know whether that's actually the case or not. I would say that the first story by Maureen Johnson, The Jubilee Express, was my favourite one, although Implausible was probably the sweetest one. And then I think they got steadily worse as we went through the book. But a very nice time on the lead up to Christmas nonetheless. So that was Let It Snow by Maureen Johnson, John Green and Lauren Myracle. And then we have made it to the final book. It's the final book of 2021. And it could only have been one lady, because I'm not sure I've read any more of her this year. Can't have a year where I don't read one. And that was I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day by Millie Johnson. Now, if you're not aware, Millie Johnson is my absolute favourite author, even though her books are largely the same. And I wouldn't say she's the best writer in the world, but reading a Millie Johnson is like having a nice warm hug for me. That being said, this one didn't feel very much like a Millie Johnson book, in the respect that it was set in one place over like 4 days, and there was like 6 characters, and we didn't deviate. There was no one else coming in, no appearances from previous book characters, previous scenes, there was no Daily Trumpet. So there was a lot about this that didn't feel like a Millie Johnson book, but I still really enjoyed it. So this follows 6 characters, they're in sort of couplets, three pairs of 2s. That doesn't make sense. 3 2s, and then they each have their own issue, I guess. So you've got Charlie and Robin, who are a older gay couple who are on their way to Scotland for a fancy holiday because, is it a spoiler? I won't say why, but there's a reason why they're going on this fancy holiday. That is quite a major part of this book. You then have Bridge and Luke, who are husband and wife, but they're there to sign the divorce papers. And then you have Mary and Jack. Mary is his PA and she's in love with him, but Jack knows nothing. But because again, huge snowstorm. There's a theme in my festive reads. They don't make it to wherever it is that they're trying to get to and end up in a little village in Yorkshire called Figgy Hollow and end up in like the pub, the inn there over Christmas. This book, because it was set in just one pub and it's a Christmassy book with lots of snow, just was really cosy, and I finished this on New Year's Eve and just felt really warm afterwards. It was lovely. It was a lovely read. It made me chuckle. It even made me choke up, which doesn't normally happen with the book. So there's a lot of emotion in it, which again, not normally something that happens with a Millie Johnson book. But what made this book most enjoyable for me is that I really liked each and every one of the characters. I think Mary was probably my personal favourite, but it's hard to pick, and that's just due to Millie Johnson's great writing of characters. Each of the couple's individual stories were really compelling and I wanted to know what happened, but then the 6 as a whole and them making the most of their Christmas even though they're snowed in was just I can't think of another word other than heartwarming. The bit I wasn't quite so sure about, there's a whole bit about magical realism in it and I wasn't quite on board with that, but we'll just push that to the side because it is such a tiny part of this book that it really didn't matter. And there's a lot of talk about Jane Austen's Persuasion, so I kind of want to read that now. But as a way to end the year, and if next year you're looking for a enjoyable festive Christmas read. I would very much recommend I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day by Minnie Johnson. So there we have it. My battery is about to die, so if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already and you want to see what I'm reading in 2022, please click that subscribe button and I will see you in the next one. Bye! Now, quick, get a thumbnail, get a thumbnail!